Disclaimer. This video doesn't necessarily have an intended audience, and will contain heavy spoilers for both gameplay and story. I am unable to record game footage, so you'll mostly get some Civ 5 gameplay while I talk. This video also features extensive comparison not only to the original game, but to other games as well, from myriad genres and developers. For times when I reference other media, I will be showing footage from them to provide visual examples. Sorry I couldn't do that for the remake. With that, onto the video. Establishment. So, the long-awaited Final Fantasy VII Remake is here, or part of it is here, and I'm sorry guys, I really tried. I really tried, but no matter how hard I did, I couldn't bring myself to love it like everyone else seems to. It might be weird to say, but this experience of playing and really hating the game is immensely frustrating, and not for the reason you might think. I wasn't expecting much. I wanted a solid gaming experience, and that was about it, but I didn't get that, at least in my estimation. To establish my credentials, so to speak, I've been playing games regularly for my whole life. I have a particular fondness for JRPGs, and have a general distaste for open-world games. I don't look for much in particular when it comes to the games I play. If I find something great, then that's awesome, but if I don't, well, a quick disclaimer. I become very annoyed very easily. I drop games a lot because I have shit to do and I don't like my time being wasted. On that note, I dropped the original Final Fantasy VII 3 separate times before finally finishing it in preparation for the remake. I didn't rush through it, don't worry. I tried to enjoy it for what it was, but even then I didn't enjoy it all that much. The original Final Fantasy VII is overhyped by a lot of people, likely because it was one of their first JRPGs, or their first look into what games could be as a storytelling medium, which, if you ask me, isn't much, but I'll save that topic for another time. The game ran slowly, especially compared to the prior FF games. There was a noticeable downgrade in complexity with the combat system. It was essentially a tweaked version of Final Fantasy VI's combat with the Esper progression system replaced by the Materia progression system, only it was done much worse. The graphics were, as you might imagine, horrible by today's standards, and I don't subscribe to the idea that you should dumb down your expectations for an older game when plenty of other games from that era look much better, like Spyro, Ocarina of Time, and of course Mario 64, all of which I like less than Final Fantasy VII, by the way. The game was also too easy. I died twice, and both times were due to my boredom-induced incompetence rather than legitimate challenge. The characters were bland, most of them acted similarly, all had pretty much the same backstory, and were boring, and had either boring or non-existent arcs. The villains suffered in the same way. The real Sephiroth, outside of Flashback that is, had 0 lines of dialogue. He only spoke through intermediaries, making his intimidation almost non-existent. I felt 0 threat from him, especially when Cloud fucked him up so bad in the flashback anyway. Shinra, all of them, were one-note, mustache-twirling evil businessmen, except for the obvious white knight of the group. No character, boring. The story meandered, it jumped from one location to the next haphazardly amid myriad plot contrivances to get the party there, like when the buggy broke and you have to wait for it to get repaired so that Red 13 could have his backstory plot happen. But even amid these countless issues that I had with the game, I came out the other end more or less happy with it. Well, happy might be overstating it, but I didn't come out severely pissed off and disappointed as I did with the remake. Good things. Before I get too caught up in bitching about this game that everyone loves, I want to join in that love for a moment. The characterization was vastly improved from the original, where they showed basically nothing other than superficial aspects. Special mention goes to Tifa and the lesser Avalanche members, all of which have been talked about a lot. The Avalanche members got some much needed development from their backstories to their personal lives. Jessie, of course, was promoted to waifu material alongside Tifa and Aerith, and she stands out as having gotten the most work put into her. She has a lot more interactions with Cloud and is openly flirtatious with him, a big departure from the waste of polygons that was in the original. The one that I was most pleasantly surprised by was Tifa. She was given a lot of vulnerability that made her a far more interesting and strong person than she was in the original. Whereas there, she was nice, caring, and selfless in her pursuits with Avalanche and Cloud, we see her having a lot more doubts this time. She finds Barrett's methods excessive, driven to drinking when she's told they're going to blow another reactor after the first mission went so terribly wrong. We see her interacting with the local neighborhood where they worry about her, she's afraid of ghosts. Maybe most importantly, she has a real anxiety when she learns of Shinra's plan to drop the plate onto the Sector 7 slums. Of course, there are some issues with that, but we'll get into them later. As well, the character models are very good. All of them are detailed and unique, the faces are highly expressive, and they move realistically and fluidly in combat, for better or worse. Also, that's about it, actually. Bad things. So I'm about to make a whole bunch of general statements, and then I will back them up in turn with more details, so bear with me here. The combat was frustrating, the side quests were terrible, the story was just as bad as ever, if not worse, the exploration was virtually non-existent, the game is fucking ugly, and the pacing was horrendous. The pacing is what I feel most strongly about. I will go on record in saying that the part of the Final Fantasy VII story that this game adapts was the best part of the original. Despite the awful villains, this was the part of the game with the best pacing. You moved briskly from one plot point to another. There was virtually no filler save for deliberate breathers after intense moments, and there was a constant state of tension and danger throughout basically the entire run of about 10 hours or so. This remake throws all of that out the window. It's been said by some Redditors, but the main method of stretching this relatively brief part of the story into a full game is with filler, whether that be side quests, long linear combat sections, or cutscene upon cutscene upon cutscene that all add next to nothing. The side quests I'll get to later, but I feel pretty justified in saying that it takes too fucking long to get anywhere. Part of that is movement. It adopts the 2018 God of War method of having predetermined button prompt style progression. You go up to a ladder, and you do a specific input and climb the ladder. Meanwhile, the characters can leap 20 feet in the air to fight enemies, but not to cross obstacles like train cars or anything like that. There's a certain level of frustration when you show characters doing cool stuff, and then they don't let you do that cool stuff to make getting around any easier. The areas you explore are mostly uninspired as well. Yes, I know this is a remake, and they kept mostly the same areas, but my issue is that they didn't do anything with them. The path to Aerith's house was long and dull, with the same color palette and general aesthetic of the scrapyard you've already done with Tifa when she was teaching you how to be a mercenary. The sewer level was just a sewer level. The city streets just looked like city streets. The reactor levels were both overly long and drawn out, especially the second one, with a massive detour to power an elevator, which is, hey, another plot contrivance to get you to go to this new area rather than keep up the pace and move on with the story. Really quick, why does it take 3 artificial suns worth of power to boot up an elevator? Whatever, never mind. Where I reached my tipping point was the tower before the plate falls. That should not have been a full area. By the time you get there, there should be like no time left to stop it. That's the point, you were too late. In the original, there were the usual random encounters that were purely for gameplay, but when you get up to the top and regroup with Barret, Reno immediately swoops down and drops the plate. No matter what the party does, they can't stop it. Whereas in the remake, the plan is to stop it, and you keep fighting until the bitter end. You even succeed, only for the plot phantoms to ruin things. We'll get to those beauties later. You even have to play a glorified auto-scroller with Aerith to show how she got Marlene, which is entirely irrelevant to the plot, as the original knew and thus didn't show. I was screaming and cursing constantly throughout this part of the game, especially when the characters constantly stopped and fucking talked to each other and reacted instead of rushing to stop the fucking plate from fucking falling. The same holds true for the rest of the game. Events that should take 20 minutes at most take upwards of an hour to 2 hours. There's nothing interesting added to these sections other than roadblocks, plot contrivances, and brief stints of character. And look, I know that they wanted to add more character, but they did not need to slow the game down so much to do so. The party already talks to each other as you explore. That was enough. I didn't need this long cutscene about the party crossing rafters in the sewer. Maybe all this is seeming like rambling to you. Fair enough, I'm mostly ranting since the negative experience is still fresh in my memory. So let's take a step back and look at the original game once again. You'll notice that it follows a clear path of tension. We start high octane, with a daring train takeover and reactor infiltration. We have a boss, plant the bomb, and leave with another daring escape via train. This is our first peak, right here. We have some downtime as we go back to the bar and have a night to ourselves. The next day we have a slower, more deliberate build up to another reactor, but not too slow. We plant the bomb and the tension suddenly spikes because we've been had. We're ambushed by Shinra and fight another boss. Tension peak once again. And then Cloud falls, which is the breaking point. Then, after that high octane stuff, we have a bit more downtime as we meet Aerith properly. There's still stuff going on in the background and foreground, with Reno trying to take Aerith for reasons unknown, and her mother's insistence on Cloud leaving for, again, reasons unknown. There's intrigue, and it's conveyed to us at a brisk pace that doesn't really need any filler or artificial extensions. Then we see Tifa and assume she's kidnapped by Don Corneo. Note, assumed. We don't get a conversation like in the remake, by the way. In any case, we infiltrate Corneo's mansion in a much shorter mini-quest and confront the man. Mini-tension spike and increase in urgency by a country mile when he reveals Shinra's plan to drop the Sector 7 plate onto the slums. We're booted out and rush over in 2 short areas, unlike the bloated ones that we get in the remake. We make it to the plate, but we're too late. We beat up Reno anyway and try to override the drop command, but to no avail. We narrowly escape and regroup at Aerith's house for another breather. We've passed the 3rd peak. Things kick into high gear as we set out to rescue Aerith, but even in this urgency there are peaks and valleys. We go and confront the president, but are ultimately captured. Tension spike as they say we're to be executed. Then tension builds and builds and builds as we follow a bloody trail until we make it back up to the president, only to find him dead by this previously unknown or esoteric character named Sephiroth. After that, a harrowing escape as the final climax to this section of the game. This is our tension curve. It's proper, for the most part. Now, let's add a timescale. We'll say each section is an hour, give or take. Depending on how long you take, it could be a little more or a little less, depending on how much you fuck around and how you handle the random battles, but whatever, this is what we're going with. Now let's jump over to the remake, and we'll see some difference. Scattered through the game are encounters with the plot phantoms, so that adds some tension wrinkles in our little graph. There's an extended sequence of subways and undercity shenanigans before you get to the second reactor, so that sucks the tension right out. You spend a surprising amount of time in the reactor itself, where you go through no less than 4 identical hallways which lead into 4 identical storage rooms, one right after the other. Oh, I forgot. They have different numbers of consoles in the storage rooms. Whatever. Anyway, we'll put that right there. I mentioned a really long walk from the church to Aerith's house, so more time there. There's a big sequence with her in like an underground construction or a train yard area, and then the mini quest to get into Corneo's abode takes a really long time compared to the original, so we'll extend that like so. After that, the sewers get expanded, and the train yard introduces a haunted aspect, so you have to fight ghosts for a while, and I missed a really good rod for Aerith, so that sucks. Luckily I bought it later. Anyway, we're adding some stuff there. Of course I mentioned the extended climbing the plate tower sequence, add some more there. After that, there are 2 more dungeons to explore, each taking at least an hour, before the party nuts up and goes to get Aerith back. Then you have an extended sequence of climbing across rooftops to get to the Shinra building, and then the Shinra building sequence is at least 3 times as long, where you take multiple detours and there are several interruptions to the main plot of rescuing Aerith and getting the hell out. And then, of course, you have the ending. We'll get to that. With all of this, they continually add character, which is good that the time is filled with something, but I think that the time is ultimately wasted. Remember, this is not the whole story. We're going to have at least 2 more games to get to know and love these characters. It doesn't need to try so hard with this one. If you look at Star Wars A New Hope, the characters are nothing like how we know them to be at the end of the trilogy. We know generally what they're about, we know Luke is a good kid, we know Han is a scoundrel with a heart of gold, etc, etc, but there's room left for each of them to develop. Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't really leave room. Yes, the characters will confront their backstory, and then they'll have a revelation about how they need to stop Sephiroth and save the planet, and how now it's personal, and they have a responsibility, and all of that, but that's largely artificial. It's not going to change how these characters act or think. It'll just be a reaffirmation of their already existing beliefs. Got a little off track there. Kind of tied with the pacing is the game's odd self-importance. Everything you do is framed as this uber important and exciting venture, which is really unnecessary. In Reactor 1, of course, the floor crumbles right as Cloud is going to cross it, so he has to do this really stupid Matrix jump up the rubble, complete with a "Man, that was so cool!" from Jesse. There was that rafter scene that I mentioned before, which takes really long and adds nothing. In the same sewers at the end, you're pursued by a bunch of fodder mobs, and it's treated as this huge threat to where there's an interaction with Tifa and Cloud that implies that he's telling her to leave him behind to die, like, "Go, I'll be fine," type stuff. A lot of emphasis is placed on the big robot boss you fight at the end of the second reactor part, to the point that most of that portion of the game is dedicated to debilitating it, as if it was some earth-shattering threat. In the end, it's just another boss. Cloud and Barret alone dealt with a similar one before, and you deal with another one almost just like it a bit earlier in the subway section too. I don't understand why this one was so big and scary. Of course, compounded with this self-importance is director Tetsuya Nomura's penchant to add unskippable cutscenes in the middle of gameplay, completely interrupting the flow of combat and wrenching control away from the player artificially. This happens all the time in boss fights, like when the first boss spider jumps to the wall, when the other big robot changes form, when Rude joins the fray on top of the tower. I could go on. Added to this are the summon animations, which are unreasonably long and unskippable. Yes, I know that they were fucking long in the original, and it wasn't fun there either, especially now that the visuals of them aren't impressive anymore, but that does not excuse the remake. Further pacing issues arise from the various little slowdowns that the game has. For some reason, modern games don't like loading screens. I understand, I don't like them either, but it's not like games have just gotten rid of them. They've just added these unskippable player-controlled movies. You know, like going through a long empty hallway in the original God of War series, climbing up random mountainsides in the new God of War game, or, in this case, going through something like tight crevices in the new Final Fantasy VII Remake. I don't get why I can't input to go into the crevice, the screen cut to black, and have me load on the other side. At least that way I can put the controller down and grab a drink instead of holding forward on the analog stick. Same deal with going up and down ladders, or having multiple sets instead of one long one. It's to artificially extend parts of the game so that it can load the next part. But that's enough on pacing, I think I've made my point. Let's just move on. One area that I'm happy isn't receiving much praise is the side quests, because they're utter garbage. Now, side quests are rarely done correctly, because developers make them to, once again, artificially extend playtime so people feel that they've got their money's worth. Some games are practically built on side quests, like the Witcher games. If you just did the main plot of The Witcher 3, you would get a decent chunk of content, sure, but not the full experience. It's not what you actually paid for. The difference then between the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Witcher 3 is that the latter has good side quests. What makes them good? Well, the general structure is that you meet a character or answer a request from a board. So let's take a typical monster hunting quest. The first one in the game even. You go to a location, find out what's wrong. The monsters in that world have reasons for being where they are, so you need to figure out what is actually there that you're trying to kill. In this case, the monster is a noon wraith, or wraiths who prefer the sun to the moon. The problem of the quest is that a man needs fresh water from a well that the noon wraith is haunting. That's his whole deal, which is fine. It provides a reasonable enough explanation for why he asked a witcher to do this. In this case, the intrigue comes from what a noon wraith is, a woman who was killed right before her wedding. The task of laying the spirit to rest isn't as simple as go here, kill thing. You have to go and investigate to even find out what you're up against. Then you have to find the object that essentially acts as the wraith's tether to the mortal world. From there, you burn it and the decaying body, and then the wraith appears to you, and then you kill it. But even during the fight itself, there is some strategy beyond hit with sword and exploit elemental weakness. It splits into copies of itself that distract you while it tries to heal. It's difficult to hit unless you specially prepared with a moon dust bomb, which turns it corporeal. Or you can lure it into a magic field from your Erden spell to produce the same effect. You can make your fight even easier if you've managed to craft the Spectre Oil, allowing you to do more damage per hit. Now we'll take Final Fantasy VII Remake's first monster hunting quest. You go to an area that you've already been to like 2 seconds ago to clear out mobs, and then you kill it. Riveting. The backstory? Oh, it was causing trouble for the people. Riveting. Any details? Hey, maybe you'll run into a guy who tried to fight it and he got his leg gnawed off or something. No? Whatever. After that, once again, riveting monster hunting quest, you get more thrilling content, like finding 3 cats for a little girl. I understand that they get very slightly better as time goes on, from robbing Corneo's stashes to exploring an optional factory, but the impetus for you doing this still isn't interesting. I don't get when people give this game a 10 out of 10 and then bitch about the side quest, which I've seen. If the side quests are so bad, then the score should be lowered. End of story. Is the main content more important? Of course it is. It's like Korok Seeds versus Shrines and Dungeons in Breath of the Wild. They're there to be distractions from the action. Except that that game was made to promote freedom, and you never really have that in this game. You're pushed from one area to another because it retains all the same plot points as the original, presented to the player with as much if not more urgency and importance. Remember, the self-importance of the game. You just have artificial downtime randomly throughout the story now that you did not have in the original. Okay, moving on. Exploration will be another short one. I'm going to lump in enemy placement here too, since it's tied more with exploration than combat, and I'll explain momentarily. First, I just want to say fuck everyone who is praising this game but bashed Final Fantasy XIII for its linearity. Again, I'll get to it. Think of a traditional RPG like Final Fantasy IV, for instance. You have overworld, you have dungeons, and you have towns. They are all segregated heavily by loading transitions, and this makes sense for the time, but not all that much sense in a real 3D space. Like, why wouldn't there also be monsters in the towns like Kaipo in the desert? It's not like there are guards or walls with doors. It doesn't make sense if you think about it, right? Well, again, it's an old game, and these places that you're exploring are less fully realized environments than gameplay quirks. Dungeons exist to be traversed, not to be lived in by the monsters. You know what I mean? Now we jump to Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it's the same thing, just without the load screens. You have very segregated areas, most of the early ones being actually gated off from you at first, with literal gates that have to be opened. Okay, what sense does this make? Especially in the Sector 5 slums where there are no gates and it's just a linear path to an entrance with no guards. The towns themselves are fine. They have a certain interconnectedness that's largely wasted by there being no real reason for it to be like that gameplay wise. Meaning, you aren't ever tested on navigating the non-linear towns, and you have a map anyway, so why bother with the confusing layouts? It just slows things down. I guess for immersion, like, this is how a town might be laid out in this world, but usually towns have structure, you know? Like, you have clear roads or paths up to houses or apartment complexes, but maybe that's just my northeastern sensibilities showing. Whatever, it's fine, I don't care enough to bitch about it. What I'm not fine with are the dungeons, or more accurately, the combat mode sections. Once you leave town, you go down a linear hallway until you get to another town. Yes, in other RPGs, dungeons have only one correct way forward, but they aren't usually so linear. I think the big problem with this is the map. It really shouldn't be there for this type of world design. Take something like Dark Souls, which adopts a very similar strategy in most of its early sections. Yes, there's a linear way forward, and once you know it, you can rush through to the end of the area like it's nothing, assuming you don't get ganked. Same thing in Final Fantasy VII Remake. There is a linear path to the end that you can take. The problem is then twofold. One is the map. Dark Souls doesn't have a map, and they don't for a reason. It's on the player to learn the level and search for the best way through it. It's a challenge. The game is testing you on your spatial awareness. But maybe that's not what Final Fantasy VII Remake was going for. Fair enough, not all games need to be hard. But Dark Souls also has worthwhile alternate paths, and quite extensive ones sometimes. Almost all of them lead to items, most have enemies guarding them, and some of them are must-get pickups, like the Firekeeper Soul in Blighttown, the Ember in Tomb of Giants, or maybe there's a sword you really want in like the Graveyard, or from the Merchant in Undead Burg. The Final Fantasy VII Remake has these little excursions, but there's rarely ever worthwhile loot to justify taking the time to get them. The game simply isn't difficult enough to justify getting that extra high potion or ether. There's already pickups like mana shards that refill MP, the cure spell is basically free to recover health, and there are bonfires, blue benches scattered liberally around the area anyway. Usually just before the big fights even, so you have no excuse to be underprepared. I will say that, eventually, the pickups get decent. Like around the train yard point, maybe a little bit after, you start picking up mega potions and even a couple elixirs. But that took me about 15 hours to get to that point, which is a long time to build up a bad habit of not caring about your loot. We're going to tack on enemy placement here as well, as I said before. You know, we're going to be a bit loose, a bit lazy with it. Just like the game. See, the developers didn't want those load screen things to enter combat. No. But they did want those big, empty, open areas to fight in. So at various intervals as you go through these linear combat sections, you'll come to an obvious crossroads or a big open area. Only in these locations will you find enemies. It's so basic. Back to Dark Souls again. You had enemy ambushes. You had tight hallways that you were forced to work around. Granted, working around them wasn't fun all the time because your weapon would clank on the walls while the enemy wouldn't do that, but still. They dared to ambush you. Again, difficulty. It was a challenge, and it was quite often a fun challenge. But Final Fantasy VII Remake clearly isn't going for that approach. Okay, fine. Let's shift gears to another Nomura series, Kingdom Hearts. You have enemies spawning in those open areas, sure, especially in Kingdom Hearts 2, since it basically dropped all exploration. But you also have some curveballs. Maybe they spawn while you're on this offshoot platform. Maybe you're in this tight box, or stairway, or this hallway. You have big mobs blocking exits in Agrabah, crowding a ledge in Hollow Bastion. Interesting enemy layout is something that's sorely lacking in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and the enemies aren't varied enough or require interesting different strategies to make mob fights anything less than a button mash with occasional magic. But again, I'll get to that later when I go into combat. For now, we'll move on to the graphics. Yes, I praise the character models, which I uphold in saying that they're excellent. In particular, the expression on Cloud's face betrays his stoic exterior, as it should. However, almost everything else is shit. This is the type of game that they don't want you to stop and look around. They don't want you to stare too hard at the screen, or else you're going to find an awful texture. everywhere, this way, that way. You can't escape them. Literally everywhere I turned, I saw a last gen texture or worse. Of particular note are the various ladder textures. Without even getting close, they appear pixelated and shit. A hilarious example is the door to the arena in Wall Market, which the game shows you up close in a cutscene, and it just looks awful. The aesthetic of the game isn't the problem either. It's the textures themselves. They're all just so low res, pixelated. It's just awful. A few more examples are the wires that stick out of concrete debris, most metal walls don't hold up to close inspection, and of course, the horrible JPEG images that the game uses for the backgrounds while you're climbing the rooftops in Chapter 15. Now, I can't explain much more without providing visual examples, which I'm currently unable to do, but trust me, boot up the game and look around, you will see shit textures. Doors, train cars, piles of rubble, everything. And this may be a nitpick. I'm willing to admit that, but it just persists so much. I just don't know how anybody can overlook it. Okay, done with that, what's next? Should I do story or combat? I guess I'll go combat because story is going to take a while. Well, actually they're both going to take a while, so let's just dive right into it, shall we? If I'm being perfectly honest, it felt like they didn't playtest the game at all in certain points. Let's break it down. We have our defensive options, offensive options, AI, aggro, player agency, and bosses. We'll go in order, starting with our defensive options, of which we have two, blocking and dodging. Dodging is pretty much useless. Why? One reason. Too few iframes, or invincibility frames. Let's jump over to Dark Souls again. Now, you might have heard that Dark Souls is hard. This is true, especially for a first-time player. It requires a lot of concentration to play well, and mistakes are heavily punished. But even in Dark Souls, you have ample iframes when you dodge, at least with the fastest dodge. If you fat roll, may God have mercy on your soul, you're playing your build wrong. When timed properly, your roll allows you to not only reposition yourself to punish the enemy with a combo or backstab, but it completely negates damage from the enemy attack. This is good. It rewards the player for playing well. However, there are exceptions. There are attacks that you can't roll through, like grab attacks, where the enemy's entire body becomes able to hit you, and tracking attacks, or when enemies basically change the laws of physics or teleport to you to hit you. These are no bueno. Everybody hates them. Jumping back to Final Fantasy VII Remake, your dodge has either no iframes or very, very few, requiring pinpoint timing. As well, most enemy attacks track you in some capacity. They are unavoidable if you are anywhere near them, which you will be if you want to hit them with Cloud or Tifa. Then, they hit you. Okay, then you can just block, right? Well, two issues with that. First, blocking puts you at a disadvantage rather than the other way around. There's only one type of block, where you take reduced damage and then kind of hop back, as if dispersing the force of the attack thrown. This is no bueno again. You are shoved away from your target, forcing you to move forward or reposition yourself, allowing them time to wind up another attack if they so choose. Cloud is the only character with a counterattack by default. You still take the damage as if you just blocked it, but then he swings. The other characters are just shit out of luck, unless you get a very terrible parry materia. And it isn't like if you block with low health you get like a once more effect from Kingdom Hearts, living on 1 HP and all. You just die. Jump back to Dark Souls. Blocking has a lot more thought put into it due to the stamina meter. If you block an attack, the amount of damage you take is always reduced, but it depends on what shield is equipped to determine how much you take, up to total damage negation, as in you take 0 from a physical hit. There are also other factors like elemental or magic damage, which all have their own damage reduction statistics as well. If your shield is raised, you cannot attack unless you're using a certain weapon like a spear. When you block, you always take a hit to your stamina. Again, how much stamina depends on equipment. Not only your shield, but your armor as well. Your stamina also recovers much slower if you have your shield up, so timing your blocks is still important even if you don't intend to parry. If an attack drains your stamina past its limit, you're stunned and opened up to a stab attack which deals heavy damage. So there's a lot of resource management in blocking. You also have the option to parry, which you have to time differently for every enemy and every attack, but if done correctly, opens them up for tons of damage. As well, just like Final Fantasy VII Remake, there's only one type of block, where your character kind of braces and kind of scoots backward. But the recovery is much quicker in Dark Souls, allowing you to get into a better position post-block. The point is that blocking, if done properly, never puts you into a disadvantageous situation. For yet another example, we have Sekiro, which is closer to Final Fantasy VII Remake in that there's no stamina. In this, blocking still takes skill to use, despite there being no stamina and no equipment. Blocking fills up your posture gauge, which will open you up to an attack if filled all the way. However, you can simultaneously fill up an opponent's posture and reduce the fill up of your own by timing a parry to your opponent's attack. When their posture is filled up all the way, you can do an instant kill move to end the fight right there. So there's still skill involved in playing defensively. While we're on Sekiro, let's go back to dodging for a second. In that game, dodging has no iframes, but you do have 2 more defensive options and there's less tracking attacks. You have a special counter for thrusting attacks, and you can jump away or on top of sweeping attacks, which is much more effective for getting you out of danger than dodging. Dodging in Sekiro is used to reposition your character to a more favorable position in relation to the enemy, whether that be away from them or kind of diagonally towards them to get around to their backside. To that end, it's almost instantaneous and doesn't do anything to interrupt the combat flow. Jump back to Final Fantasy VII Remake, and none of this holds true. Briefly back on dodging, it's a severe change in animation that has to finish before you're allowed to do anything else, making you ineffective in repositioning or fucking even dodging attacks, and does nothing but slow you down. You also have no jump button. On blocking, you have no stamina bar, so there's no resource management to make you consider blocking over doing something else. There is an incentive to block, as it's reduced damage on largely unavoidable attacks, but there's no way to make yourself come out on top of these situations. The real problem is that you're mostly just forced to eat damage and are expected to shrug it off and heal. This isn't really fun for any type of game, really, where people like to do it really well and efficiently and avoid damage when they can. Here, you really just have to hope for the best. Offensive options fare a bit better, thankfully. Unfortunately, this is a modern Tetsuya Nomura game, so we're largely screwed anyway. So the basic flow of combat is based around an ATB gauge, you know, like all those games that this one wasn't supposed to be like. Each character has 2 ATB gauges, which fill up slowly throughout the battle. Hitting enemies fills it up much quicker, so that's what you want to be doing. Once one or both are filled, you can enter a menu with the X button and select a command for that character to do, from doing a special attack to casting magic to using an item to calling a summon. You unlock more of all of these options as the game progresses for every one of the characters. Your offensive options are these, plus the basic combos that each character has. Well, Cloud and Tifa have combos, Barret and Aerith just hold the attack button and go. All in all, if handled properly, this would all be enough. The devil, however, is in the details. Unfortunately, the basic combos are terrible. They have no weight, they have no punch, they do shit damage, and they're really only useful in building the ATB gauge, with one notable exception. And I honestly don't understand why that is. I don't get why Tetsuya Nomura hates regular physical combos. He's made them worse and worse in all of his games since Kingdom Hearts 2, and I don't get it. He just has this habit of either making them really weak or have really long animations, or both. This holds true for all 4 playable characters in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Cloud's basic attacks have no weight, which is hilarious considering the size of his sword. Tifa's attacks are quick and light, which makes sense, but the animations are incredibly long for the amount of damage that they do. Barret is just awful. You do practically no damage except for a burst at the end of his volley. Aerith's magic shots actually do decent damage for their size, but they freeze her in place as she twirls around and are incredibly slow to hit. That notable exception that I mentioned earlier is Cloud's Punisher mode. His attacks are slower, yes, but they're much meatier and do good damage, especially the finisher, which hits 3 separate times. This slowness transfers to the combat abilities as well, unfortunately. Braver has really long end lag. Infinity's End is like Birth by Sleep Santetsuken, or, awful. Star Shower has deliberate and fucking insane startup lag, though it's actually one of the few abilities that's justified because it's very powerful if it does go off, and has decent range since Tifa dashes forward to start the attack, which is the problem that Infinity's End has. Sorceress Storm suffers twofold because it's slow, and Aerith is super squishy, so she doesn't like to be in close range, the range of the attack. I could go on. So okay, the attacks are slow, so what? You praise Dark Souls so much and those attacks are slow as shit. True, but there, it was deliberate. You have exactly as much lag on your attacks as the enemies have on theirs. It's like that to make you think and commit to every action, and you can cancel a lot of attacks and lag with a roll even then. In the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's to look flashy. There's no reason that Cloud can't burst into a roll at the end of Braver, but you can't. Instead, you have to wait for him to do his little hop back to his feet and get back to his neutral stance. Same with switching to his Punisher mode. He has a little animation that he does, completely killing flow to any combo you're trying to do. These animations wouldn't necessarily be a problem either if there were any iframes associated with them, but you can be easily pot-shotted out of these through no fault of your own, especially in mob fights. Some enemy attacks come out faster than your attacks take to do, meaning you could start the attack on an enemy, they could attack first and knock you out of the animation. You don't even have iframes while you're attacking. You could be mid-animation, like with Cloud flipping through the air for his Braver, but before the hurt box appears when he slams his sword down, you can be hit out of the attack and lose not only health from being hit, but the wasted ATB bar that you used for the attack that got interrupted by a fucking off-screen rat or something. This holds true for magic as well, where you can be hit out of the cast and lose both your used ATB bars and your MP. This happens a lot towards the endgame, especially for me. When enemies are fast, there's a lot of them, and the little annoyance that high tier spells take longer to cast, making your caster even more likely to get hit during it. Even then, some spells won't do anything regardless. There are 4 offensive elemental spells: Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, and Arrow. Blizzard and Arrow are useless, even to enemies weak to them. Now, Arrow might be a bug. I casted it several times on an enemy in plain sight, and it did nothing. No damage, no stagger, zippo. It worked once out of 5 times I used it on a lesser Drake in the train yard, so after that I stopped wasting my MP on it. At least, that's what I thought at first. The base Arrow spell is still useless, but it was only after I tried Aurora near the end of the game on the rooftops that I figured out that it functions exactly like Blizzard. And unfortunately, Blizzard is entirely useless. You cast it, it shoots out, and you think it's going to explode on impact like Fire and Thunder, but no. Instead, it hits the enemies for no damage and no stagger. It forms a crystal diamond for 3 seconds, and then it explodes and does damage. Except it won't do damage, because the enemy will have moved on by then, because it's 3 goddamn seconds of nothing stopping it from moving. The best use for Blizzard materia is to combine it with Elemental to get the effect on your physical hits, in my opinion. Otherwise, good luck exploiting ice weaknesses. Truth be told, the only enemy I found any use for it were the sewer crabs, because they have a really long, stationary guard animation. The others always flew away. Oh yeah. And when enemies hit you with the initial Blizzard cast, it stuns you royal, especially with higher tier spells. Fire and Thunder generally hit, at least I haven't seen them fail other than getting hit out of the casting, but the damage they do rarely justifies the cost. Yes, you can cast a spell on an enemy and exploit their weakness, sure, but is it worth the MP cost, or should you just save it to nuke the boss or a flying enemy? More on those later. Like, if I do Thundara, which uses 11 MP out of like 65 max, and it does 600 to 1000 damage, or if an enemy is weak, maybe closer to 1600 to 2000, why would I do that instead of just doing another move like Braver or Triple Slash and a physical combo in Punisher mode to the same effect, and with no MP cost? By the same token, why would I use Barrier or Sleep? Do their effects matter in the grand scheme of things? Not really. I've used Haste to some success, but only because it led to an increase in offensive potential rather than just being an offensive spell. But that was the only worthwhile buff that I found. As for other offensive options, you have the character's triangle commands. Cloud switches to Punisher mode, we've already talked about that, moving on. Barret lets him unload 4 powerful shots for no cost other than a really long cooldown for the move. You can press triangle again during the cooldown to charge the attack, but it isn't a one and done. You'd have to do it like 3 times consecutively to fill it back up from scratch. And good luck with that when it locks you in place with no defense. Unfortunately, that's basically his only good source of damage with a ranged weapon other than like Maximum Fury. Aerith has a big magic doohickey that you have to charge up, which is never worth using, as it locks her down for the entire charge time with no defense. Tifa's is the most usable of the secondary 3. She has a series of 3 attacks, only one of which is available at the start of battle. She has an ATB ability called Unbridled Strength, which not only buffs her damage, which is good, but it gives her an extended combo, and changes the triangle command to the next tier out of 3. You have the initial one, level 2, which is Omni Strike, and level 3, which is Rise and Fall. Using one of these higher tier triangle commands boots her down a tier. I'd find these useful if things like Star Shower, True Strike, and Overpower didn't exist, but they do, and do Rise and Fall and Omni Strike's part way better than them, and don't downgrade her power upon use. The issue I find with this whole system is the lack of real flow in the combat. Now, the way I play is that I pretty much only use commands as finishers, or when an enemy is staggered. I like to play that way because I don't like to pause the game to input commands. To me, it ruins the appeal of the combat in that it's fast-paced and frantic. But apparently I'm playing it wrong. You build up ATB so fast for whatever character you're playing, and the physical combos are so pathetic most times, that it leads me to assume that you're supposed to disregard the regular combos and spam special attacks and magic. As well, apparently you're supposed to be constantly switching characters, because none of them build ATB quickly when they're controlled by the AI. This way, all characters constantly build up ATB to constantly spam commands, but then you'd just be pausing and unpausing repeatedly in the middle of combat to issue them. What kind of fun is that? Breaking it down a little, if I'm really supposed to be spamming commands, why are the combos so long? If they're going to be so long and so weak, why include them instead of just having the command system? And if I'm supposed to be spamming commands, well, the question remains, why would I want to do that? Because it literally stops everything for you to menu. That's bad flow, and I don't care that it's part RPG. Kingdom Hearts is part RPG too, and the menu is done in real time there, making you, learn how to menu properly instead of letting you freeze time and fumble about in it for 3 or 4 seconds in the middle of the action. I also know that there is a shortcut system in the game. Unfortunately, it never felt the need to tell me about it, despite its already copious use of pop-up tutorials. Another issue with it is that making sure you're both locked onto the right target and in range is difficult to do, considering the attack can miss even still if the target decides to move during the startup. I personally never tried it with items, but my understanding is that it then slows down time like normal so you can select a target, which is a non-option as far as I'm concerned because it's just as easy as going into the menu and using an item. Is its inclusion welcome? Yes. Do I wish I'd known about it sooner to get used to it? Yes. Does it help the fact that you still have to manually input the commands for your 2 other characters? No. As an aside, I'd find all of these commands and triangle attacks a lot more useful if you could assign party members to use them while you're playing as someone else, kind of like gambits in Final Fantasy XII. With that system, you can assign AI party members to perform certain actions if certain conditions are met. For example, you could set your white mage to heal any character that falls below 40% health, or you could assign a party member to use a remedy on any other party member with an abnormal status effect. This game doesn't let you assign AI priorities at all. You can't even tell Barret to target the out-of-range enemies. Of course, this talk of AI manipulation leads to the AI being absolutely horrid in this game. I'm mainly referring to the party AI with this particular point, though the enemy AI is also pretty bad. My main problem is your own lack of control over what they do, as mentioned before. Some people are saying that you're supposed to be constantly switching characters, but that just doesn't sit well with me. Take this example. You come into a combat arena with 2 out-of-range turrets that immediately open fire, and 3 melee enemies of varying types. It doesn't really matter in this scenario. What's your priority in the encounter? The out-of-range guys, obviously, because they can snipe you out of your combos and deal a lot of damage over time unless they're dealt with. Okay, I have Barret in my party, and I'm playing as Tifa. He can take out the ranged folks, right? Well, if you don't play as Barret, then no, he won't. Or at least there's no way to tell him to do that. Your only option is to switch to him and kill the turrets yourself. This would be fine if aggro wasn't all sorts of fucked, but I'll get back to that. Let's assume you bite the bullet and switch to Barret. At least your other party members will distract the melee guys, right? Well, more often than not, your party members will just stand around, guard attacks, and generally do fuck all. They simply have too little aggression in their programming. I find that the ranged characters do more, but it's still not really all that much. In fact, I let some combat encounters play out without my input, and it was absolutely hilarious. Out of 5 rounds of attack, without enemy interruption mind you, Barret only did his big burst at the end of his hold square volley once. Over the course of the fight, that ratio stayed the same, and it's that same way for everyone else. Occasionally your party will attack, but only with basic combos. They have no tactics programmed into them other than scripted, get out of the way of big boss attack stuff. For an example of how bad it is, there's a boss in the endgame that you fight with Aerith and Barret alone. I switched to Barret, who was attacking the boss at the time when I wasn't controlling him, except his AI was so stupid that it couldn't recognize that he was standing behind a pillar and not hitting the boss. I have fought enemies weak to fire, with Cloud having fire attached to the elemental materia on his weapon, and him not go after them. They will not exploit enemy elemental weaknesses with magic spells at all. They won't prioritize enemies with low health, or ones that the party leader is targeting, or anything, and their ATB bars fill up so slowly. There needed to be a Gambit-like system for this to work. Your party members need to have actual intelligent AI to them. It would be perfect. Allow an option to set AI patterns like in FF12. That's literally all they need to do. And please understand that I'm not asking it to be in-depth. I don't need to micromanage and menu even more than I already have to in this game. I just want to be able to assign who the AI targets and have them be intelligent in exploiting weaknesses. I want Barrett to attack the ranged enemies without switching to him. As an example of how this can work without being overbearing, we're going to go to Kingdom Hearts 2. You can assign your party to attack enemies that Sora isn't attacking. You can have them fight near him, target the same enemy as him, or do nothing. It was in your control, even if what they did during combat wasn't. But in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, you either have to just let the AI be brain dead and just go about your own business, or you have to constantly babysit every character constantly, even if you don't like playing as them. Because if you don't, then they might not be prepared to attack when the boss is staggered. As another aside, I don't understand what's so fun about staggering the enemy and going through like 10 to 15 seconds of menus to input commands for the characters and then watching it play out. I'd like it a lot more if those commands were input in real time, like a real-time combat system should allow. Speaking of which, we're going to jump over to another game again, this time to FF13. This game also has ATB bars used to attack and 2 AI-controlled party members. The difference is that there is good AI attached to them, helped by the game's excellent job system. So long as you know an enemy's weaknesses, your party members will exploit it when they can. Ravagers will use Thunder on enemies weak to it. Synergists will buff a character in whatever stat they're strongest in first to maximize damage. Saboteurs will debuff with whatever the enemy is most susceptible to. Medics will prioritize healing low health characters. I could go on and on, but the point is that this AI has very understandable and useful tactics built into it, and it acted at every available opportunity. So you could reliably keep up pressure, juggle an enemy in the air, or time your attacks to match a buff or debuff applied by your party. It was blanket across roles as well, rather than tied to individual party members. So it didn't matter if it was lightning or snow being the Ravager. If an enemy was weak to water, they'd use it. Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't have anything like that. Again, they just stand there. I've switched to Cloud, who is a mile away from the action. Barrett and Aerith don't prioritize ranged enemies, as I've stated numerous times. Cloud won't even try to use his Punisher mode. No character uses any of their triangle attack, actually, and none exploit any kind of weakness the enemy has. At this point, I would rather the other party members just not be there if they don't effectively draw aggro or don't effectively do damage. Why not just have one party member active at a time? In fact, let's explore that a little bit. Really quick, we're going to jump back to an earlier point. I mentioned that some people were saying that that's the point of the combat system. The terrible party AI's lack of use of abilities and tactics and slow ATB buildup for non-player controlled party members was to force the player to constantly switch between them. In theory, this tactic would be sound. I'll go into this later, but enemies tend to aggro onto whatever character you're controlling, so switching constantly would prevent that from happening. All of your characters would continually build ATB to use abilities with, and you could have more gameplay variety. This is all good, right? Well, let's switch gears for a moment, and indulge me. Imagine the same game with a twist. Only one party member is active at a time, so only one is on the field with the enemies. But you can still switch freely between them. We'll just say the next character materializes in place of the one you were playing as before. I understand that you have to change the enemy AI and health pools, but bear with me. What if each character served a specific role within the party? Let's imagine a boss with lackeys that fly out of range as a general example. You would switch to Barrett to take care of the flyers, then switch to Tifa to build stagger with your quick and relentless hits, exploit elemental weaknesses and buff the player with Aerith, and then go into Cloud for the heavy damage once the enemy is staggered. But wait, I hear you say. That's how the game already is, isn't it? Well, not really. Everyone can do everything, save for range versus out of range. Everyone can buff and exploit elemental weaknesses competently, since it's not necessarily the damage of the spell, it's the stagger effect that you're looking for most of the time. Every character can fill stagger with combos and abilities. Everyone can do heavy damage, especially once they unlock their big attacks like Star Shower, Ray of Judgment, Maximum Fury, and Infinity's End. If everyone can do everything, why the fuck would I switch off of whoever I like playing as most? The answer is that you won't want to, or at least I never did. The result of all of this is a combat system that's clunky, poorly thought out, frustrating to play, and that's just on the player's end. In terms of enemy design, it's god-awful too. Worse than the party AI sometimes. I've already gone over the penchant to use tracking attacks, and I won't go over it again other than reiterating how stupid it is, almost as stupid as Dark Souls 3's teleporting doggos, but I digress. There are two things that really pissed me off when I played, and I do mean pissed me off. My brother can attest to that, as I yelled and cursed at the game while fighting a few times. First is the lack of hit stun, which is absolutely unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. Hit stun is when you hit an enemy and it stuns them, as you might imagine. A game has to be carefully designed around it if there isn't going to be hit stun, and this one clearly was not. When I'm wielding a gigantic Buster Sword and I'm bashing a Shinra Mook, not a boss, a Mook, over the head with it, I expect him to keel the fuck over like a wet noodle. In this game, however, he just shrugs it off and bashes my face in with a baton. What sense does that make? Oh, and of course, his wimpy attack sends me flying away about 50,000 feet. What the fuck ever. I hear you saying that hit stun would make the game too easy, that you could just lock enemies down with Tifa or Barret and never get hit. Well, I present to you Kingdom Hearts 2, which has hit stun on most humanoid enemies or smaller, and it's still challenging on critical mode. It shines on bosses in particular because of the revenge value system in place. Basically, every boss has a revenge value, which is a in-game value that's invisible to the player for how many hits or how much damage they can take before they automatically break out of your combo and retaliate. If you can predict how and when a boss will retaliate, you can then counter their counterattack and get them back into a combo. But if you don't, or if you don't know how to, you have to dodge or block, or you get wrecked. It's brilliant. Final Fantasy VII Remake just has no hit stun. Enemies tank right through all of your attacks unless they're pressured or staggered, which makes it really not fun to attack, because it feels like I'm just hitting the air in front of them. Sure, there's damage numbers and sound effects, but damn, no reaction? Was I wrong then? Like, Nomura just made a game with revenge value in it like a year ago, with Kingdom Hearts 3. You'd think he would stick with that to make bosses more enjoyable. Second are flying enemies, and this ties into a problem I haven't addressed much yet, which is the character's inability to jump. See, when faced with a flying enemy, your melee character will leap 80 feet into the air in about half a second, then do a basic combo onto them, and then drop back to the ground like a rock. Okay, cool. Whatever. It's more than we got in the new God of War game, right? Well, sure, but remember, there's no hit stun. Flying enemies in particular tend to run away from you a lot, so you jump after them, get off one of your hits if you're lucky, and then they'll be out of range for the rest. Thanks. Those helicopter assholes on the tower were what set me off personally, but none of the flying enemies are good. This is also the same group of enemies where Arrow didn't work on them in the train yard, even when it was their elemental weakness. Now we move on to aggro, which this game also utterly fails at. Basically, everything zeroes in on whoever you're controlling. Now, there are exceptions, which I randomly found scattered throughout my playtime, but about 95% of the time, this was the case for me. Immediately, this made Aerith useless as a party leader. She's frail, is slow to attack, has the worst dodge in the game, which is saying something, and runs slowly so she can't escape any attacks. Barret fares better in that he has a lot of HP, but his damage is so bad that using him is always a chore anyway. Tifa and Cloud fare better still, as they can generally dish out whatever they take, at least when the AI stars align to where you don't get ganked. And this wouldn't be so bad if enemies weren't so aggressive. But I found that they're relentless most of the time. I really tried playing as Aerith when she joined. I really did, but I would just get ganked over and over and over again. And my AI Cloud wasn't helping much either. The only enemy types that I found to not mindlessly try and gank you were the enemies that had some kind of defense against your attacks. So flying enemies, enemies with shields, and stuff like that. Flying enemies tend to run away from you or wander above you between attacking the leader. Shield enemies just kind of slowly pace around, keeping their shields to the leader at all times, but are surprisingly slow to turn when you run around to their backside. The ghosts in the train yard that can put up shields double as flying enemies, so they get a double helping of bullshit. Other than those guys though, everyone else ganks you. They rush toward the leader or, again seemingly randomly, another party member with no rhyme or reason or tactics. Let's go back to Final Fantasy XIII briefly. We have the Sentinel role, which is specifically designed to tank and draw aggro. That's what it does, and it does it well. Even AI-controlled Sentinels will draw aggro before they do their Steel Guard. Granted, most other action games don't have a party, and the Kingdom Hearts games generally have the enemy zero in on the player character too, but the difference is that those games have better movement and defensive options than this one. Blocking is complete. You block all damage. You have counterattacks if you block, and you have reprisals if you get hit. You have iframe dodge rolls, air stepping, quick running, aerial dodging, and the fucking reflect spell. That's it. That's all I've got on aggro. It's terrible. Player agency is a bit esoteric, I'll admit. But what I mean is how much control you have about the outcome of a fight. In this game, you'd think that it would be absolute, right? You can control any of the three characters at any time, and thus you have access to all of their abilities at the same time. The problem then lies in the preparation. Now I admit, this isn't just a problem in this game, but one in the original as well. The materia system is much, much worse than the Esper system in Final Fantasy VI, the one it ripped off. In that game, you assign Espers to characters, and after battle they earn AP for that Esper. At certain AP thresholds, a character inherits a spell from the Esper even when the Esper is removed. So once a character inherits the cure spell, that spell stays on them forever. There's a permanence to the system that allows you to create super characters, ones that can do anything, and it allows you to mix and match their roles to create a really powerful party. The same can't be said for the materia system. Like that game, you assign materia to a character and it grants them magic. In this case, it just gives them whatever spell the materia has, so a fire materia will grant the fire spell. After battle, you gain AP, which goes to level up materia. Higher level materia grants access to higher level spells like Fira and Firaga, or Fire 2 and Fire 3 as in the olden days. The difference is that the spell is inherent to the materia and not the character. You can just as easily unequip that materia and put it on someone else, and then they'd have the fire spell. There's a lack of permanence, as you can tell. This could be seen as good, as it theoretically forces the player to make specific builds for specific fights, except that there are two problems with that. First, I don't see how more menuing is more fun than more fighting, as in, why would you want to micromanage your materia for each big encounter, rather than just continually build up spells with espers and then have all of those builds active simultaneously, allowing for mixing and matching and more creative strategy within fights. Second, it doesn't really force you to do that. If you don't run away from random battles, you'll be more than strong enough to take on any of the story bosses with minimal management of materia. Jumping back to Final Fantasy VII Remake, it has the same problem as the original, except it's twofold. With the original, you could make the argument that it's an RPG and managing equipment and materia is one of the main parts of the game. I would even agree with you on that. But Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't an RPG, at least no more so than Mass Effect or Horizon Zero Dawn. No, Final Fantasy VII Remake is an action game. The combat is action-oriented with RPG elements. So in an action game, I want to spend even less time in menus, but there actually might be more in the remake than in the original because of weapon upgrading. Winding everything back to player agency, I played this like an action game with RPG elements. I was lax about my materia placement and didn't really care about much other than always having cure on one or two of my party members and keeping stock of my items. And the fact is that playing it this way wasn't very fun, because I was almost never prepared for any specific fight. The problem is that I'm between a rock and a hard place. Either I can look up enemy and boss weaknesses and micromanage my stuff and plan accordingly inside boring menus for the sake of a more interesting fight, or I can go in unprepared and get by using the same boring strategies I use constantly and be bored that way instead. I feel like I'm the only deciding factor in a fight, but I can't really be bothered to prepare enough to make it feel like I'm really turning the tides with my planning and knowledge and skill. But of course, I've mentioned bosses several times now. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but they're not that great either. Now, I'm not going to bitch about hits done when talking about the big robots and stuff. It's expected with things like that for them to eat through attacks. But when I'm fighting Reno and Rude, they should be cowering in goddamn fear. But no, I'm cutting through the air in front of them. I forgot. Anyway, my main problem with the bosses is that they're just as bloated as the rest of the game. Their health bars are enormous, with some fights taking upwards of 15 to 20 minutes to do from start to finish, which is absolutely mind-boggling. I could watch a whole anime episode in the time it takes to beat these fuckers. Most all of them have unskippable cutscenes attached to them, signaling a phase change or a big attack. These are frustrating because more often than not they interrupt a stagger. And yeah, I didn't really explain staggering enemies, did I? Basically, you do enough damage or deal enough hits and the enemy becomes staggered, where they take 1.6 times the normal damage normally. So yeah, you stagger a boss, do some damage, and then they cutscene away from you mid-stagger and waste all of the work you put in to bring them to that point. It's a complete slap in the face to the player, really. The same goes for not having the courtesy to keep an enemy staggered during a limit, because all of those have unbearably long startup lag. Final Fantasy XIII kept them staggered for a full ATB attack's duration to offer an example of it working. Other than that, they suffer from the same issues as the rest of the enemies. Copious amounts of tracking attacks, no hits done when it makes sense to have it, and now we add on top of that monstrous health bars and mid-fight cutscenes so jarring that the fight literally resets every time it happens instead of, flowing naturally. I suppose another problem is that there isn't much variety, and I know that sounds really stupid, but hear me out. All of the bosses fall into one of two categories, big tank or humanoid with weapons. Even the biological monsters act identically to the giant robots you fight, so they're all tanks. Sure, they have various context-sensitive moves, like the Mega Rat causing a flood and the tank shooting missiles, but the concept is generally the same. The humanoid enemies are few and far between, and none of them are particularly enjoyable if I'm being honest. Reno simply moves at too quick a pace for this game. You can cheese him with the deadly dodge materia in your first fight and gank him with the party in the second. That is, if the ATB gods heed your prayers. But if you go at him straight and alone, prepare to be fucked. He acts faster than the cooldown for even your basic combos. So if you don't anticipate his attacks about 2 seconds prior to it happening, you're gonna get hit. Rude has the issue of copious grabbing attacks. Now, maybe I just got unlucky, but in the second fight when he tag teamed with Reno, he did it 4 times in a row, leaving no chance for me to act in between them, and of course, they track. Other than that small issue, which could be fixed in a patch by not letting him repeat moves over and over, he's the most tolerable. Rufus Shinra is bad. He ganks you with his dog, and when you get him alone, he counters literally everything you throw at him, and I mean that literally. You have to wait for him to reload, which you're told is happening with big red letters like you're an idiot, and then you can attack. Of course, you have to use your commands and ruin the flow of combat if you want to do any real damage to him, as you're only allowed 3 hits of your basic combo before he retaliates. Sephiroth suffers from the same reason as Reno, he's simply too fast. He aggroes onto the party leader in about 1 second, teleports over, and attacks. Only by continuously switching during his attacks, letting your party get wrecked in the process, can you have any breathing room. Of course, he's designed this way to justify no hit stun. You have a party of 3, so the game feels the need to make him act as 3 people all the time, or have the same collective strength as a group at least. Oh yeah, that's right, you fight Sephiroth in this game. I don't like it either, but we'll get to that momentarily. I will admit that I'm not the best at judging boss fights, especially ones this long. I just tend to zone out after a while, which is a problem, yes, but then it could be considered the game's fault for not engaging me properly. But now, we're gonna come to the big one. The elephant in the room. We're gonna talk about the story. For those that aren't aware, this game only covers about 1/5 of the original game's narrative, from the start until the party leaves Midgar for the first time. We've already gone over how this fills up this time and bloats it into a full game in itself, so I won't go into that. In fact, much of the story is the same as the original, it just takes a lot longer for the plot points to happen. Because of that, I don't really want to bitch about it any more than I already have. Instead, let's talk about the changes that were made to the plot and characterization in no particular order or method. So, Tifu was vastly improved, as I said before. Barrett warmed up to me after a while once he started poking fun instead of bitching all the time. The other members of Avalanche were greatly fleshed out, which is good, to make their inevitable deaths have more impact. Red 13's voice was cool, even if he had no character other than Kill Hojo. Where the cast loses me is Aerith. I'll admit that I never really liked her in any iteration other than Crisis Core. She was always just a plot device to me. Nothing more, nothing less. So I was actually pretty excited when I saw how good the characters were before she was introduced. And I would even say that I liked her for a while after she joined the party, but then she started getting on my nerves. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when it happened, but it did. Aerith Gainsborough became quirky girl to me. That was all I saw and all I heard whenever she talked. In general, Final Fantasy VII Remake over-emotes its characters. They do the head tilt that you'd see in an anime. They're very expressive with their hand gestures and overly emphatic when expressing gratitude or joy or fun. I find that it negatively affected Aerith the most. Her quirky girl attitude quickly wore thin for me, and I ceased caring about her entirely pretty much right after she left the party. Is that incredibly unfair of me? Of course it is, but I can't help the fact that I've seen dozens of quirky girls in dozens of other media. I've seen it. I'm tired of it, especially when this game does nothing with it that I haven't seen before. She's the girl that acts innocent and airheaded to hide the fact that she knows more than she'll let on. She keeps her real feelings bottled up inside and puts on a sweetheart persona which hides a deep trauma and tragic past or fate. Now, this may just be me, but I much preferred Aerith when she had nothing to do with the plot, like in Crisis Core. She was important to Zack, and Zack alone in that game. She was nervous and unsure of herself, she was sheltered, reserved, but she had a kind soul that wanted to spread beauty to the desolate slums with her flowers. Nothing like this amalgamation of quirky tropes that this game gave me. And that's not to say the other characters are any less of walking cliches. You have the stoic mercenary, the big angry black guy, the talking pet, and the team mom. All of the party can be just as easily slotted into these archetypes, but I guess I just found the others to be less grating? I don't know, moving on. So if you didn't know, both Biggs and Wedge survive. That pissed me off a lot. Their entire purpose in the narrative was to die. The point of the plate falling scene was to show the hopelessness of the situation. Your friends are dropping like flies around you, and the villains have won by dropping the plate. It's to provide an even greater determination to stop them. Instead, the game cops out by devoting all of this time to them, even giving Biggs a decent quote-unquote death scene, and then letting both of them survive. Well, Jessie doesn't, but she was a thought anyway. Oh yeah, they made Jessie a bit of a thought. Wedge comments about her voracious flirting with Cloud, saying it's all a game to her and to not trust her, implying that she's done this rodeo with both Wedge himself and probably a lot more guys. It took the game less than an hour to throw in Sephiroth. Again, that pissed me off, though more in hindsight. In the moment, I was just kind of shaking my head and laughing at the awfulness of the decision. So, of course, Sephiroth was the main villain of the original game. Everyone knows that, and there isn't likely to be anyone who buys this game that doesn't know that. Of course, what some people may not know is that Sephiroth didn't have much of a presence in the game until way late into the story. He was there, sure, but his appearances were fleeting, and you were always one step behind him in your pursuit. They're so conservative with him that the actual, real Sephiroth doesn't meet the party until the final battle of the game, and he has no lines of dialogue outside of backstory. Everything you see until then are illusions and Genova parts bent to his will. And yes, that includes the scene where Aerith dies. But the remake, man, it just throws this guy into your face at every available opportunity, especially towards the end. In the original, his first act in the narrative was killing President Shinra, as a sign of, this is my game now, I'm the villain. Once you enter the Shinra HQ through various cutscenes, the remake has him appear or be mentioned 4 separate times, all before he shows up and kills Shinra. And then, of course, he dominates almost every scene thereafter until the very end. Even before that happens, he appears randomly to Cloud throughout the adventure. The bad part is, I know why they did it. It's a Final Fantasy VII game. You can't have a Final Fantasy VII game without Sephiroth, right? Well, you could easily have one without him. Imagine how good of a cliffhanger it would have been to have Sephiroth butcher the president randomly and then fly off laughing at the party. Bam! Instant sequel bait. And good sequel bait. It was just like holding Luke Skywalker until the end of Force Awakens, even though, that movie was also a raging pile of shit. Sephiroth should not dominate the story this much. When he first appeared in the original, Cloud switched gears at the earliest available opportunity to track him down. Shinra became a minor threat in comparison as soon as Sephiroth was revealed to be alive and wreaking havoc. Here, Cloud sees Sephiroth constantly and just shrugs it off? Why? Are we led to assume that he's been seeing visions of Sephiroth constantly? He doesn't act that way. That might have actually been interesting, to have this devil on Cloud's shoulder the whole time that he's grown to live with. Instead, he freaks out and hyperventilates in the same way every time it happens, and he gets these headaches throughout the story when he sees trippy visions, and is clearly in pain and in distress, and there's no mention made of any of it. Tifa at least would be in a tizzy about them, but no, she just lets it drop the second Cloud says to. It's ridiculous considering how often it happens. Speaking of visions, they're changed from what they were in the original game too. In the original, spoilers, they were Zack, either his spirit in the life stream or a manifestation of Cloud's broken memory of him. They always gave him advice and reminded him of certain events in his life at key points. In this one, Zack is not shown to have any influence on these visions. They just appear to be normal, probably induced by Sephiroth instead for reasons unknown. And I say reasons unknown because their connection seems to be a lot stronger, and they've changed quite a bit, so it very well could be different from the original. In these visions, Cloud sees the future. Yes, you heard that right. He sees the future and is given glimpses of when Aerith will die. It's fucking hilarious. So you'll notice that I've been avoiding the actual elephants in the room. It's time we address them, isn't it? I suppose we have to at some point. The single biggest departure from the original game that the remake introduces are the plot phantoms, or whispers as they're called. They're the flying ghost cloaks that you'll see constantly throughout the adventure. At first, they were a minor ripple in an otherwise faithful remake, but then they get explained. We still don't know exactly where they came from, but we do know their agenda. They are arbiters of fate, designed to sway history back into its predetermined path when it starts to go off course. Yes, they ensure that destiny will prevail. Okay, so now we have Final Fantasy XIII again, with the whole change your fate motif. In the final battle, you fight the plot phantoms to change the fate of the planet from where it's headed. And where it's headed is down the plot of the original game. Throughout this remake, these plot phantoms have ensured that events play out the same as they did in the original. The party would have stopped the plate from falling in this one, but the plot phantoms prevent them from doing it at the last second. Sephiroth fucking kills Barret, but the plot phantoms magically bring him back from the dead. That, and they just get in the way, like when they ambushed Avalanche in the Sector 7 slums. Now the issue with these are clear. The limits of their power isn't known, they can prevent movement, cause heavy wind, and bring people back from the dead. Because we don't know their limits, we have to assume that they have none. They can do anything to make the plot happen how the writers want them to. Oh, but I hear you say, they're only here to make sure things happen like they did in the original game, right? Well, sure, for now. But anyway, that's just lazy writing. If the changes to the story make it to where a different outcome than what you want will happen, then something has to change. Either change the story back, or change the outcome. Don't add a deus ex machina to the equation, that's just so boring. We don't know if these plot phantoms are always floating around, or if they're summoned by the planet to prevent history from fucking up at moments where it could diverge. The game seems to imply that the whispers that you encounter exist at all times and at every point in history simultaneously. When you beat the Whisper God thing at the end, you seem to destroy the Whispers entirely, so that they never existed. This is important because they existed during Zack's final battle. The ending cutscene then implies that, since the Whispers weren't there to ensure that Zack dies, he actually survives the battle and makes it to Midgar with Cloud. Either that, or it's a vision seen by both Cloud and Aerith. So now we have a paradox. We are following protagonists from a timeline that no longer exists and can never have existed because now the Whispers have never existed, meaning that time wouldn't have played out in the way that it did for the party to form and then challenge and kill the Whispers, making it so that the Whispers couldn't have died, but if they did exist, then they would have died. You know, you following? I mean, what else are we to assume from the ending? I guess it could be that it was a vision, like I said, but why would they make it a point to show Whispers during Zack's final battle if they weren't there to ensure that he died? Because, that's how history is supposed to play out, isn't it? We are shown that that isn't what happened, so was it a dream? Was it what Cloud and Aerith wanted to happen? Well, that doesn't make sense because Cloud doesn't even remember who Zack is at this point. He still thinks he was in Soldier, right? So was it just Aerith's vision? If so, why were both her and Cloud shown walking past Zack in the ending, all symbolic like? Beyond the plot phantoms themselves, it's what they do to the story and themes that really bother me more than anything. Yes, that ending battle was stupid and shoehorned in, but the damage done to the narrative is greater than that. Like I said at the beginning, I didn't like the original game's story. This section that the remake retells was the best part of that, but I'd barely put it above decent even still. What I will say about the game, however, is that it clearly knew what it wanted to be about. It was environmentalism personified. The planet is a living creature, practically given sentience through the lifestream. The villains are those who would exploit it, and you, as eco-terrorists and protagonists, must break down the system and return the planet to its natural state and teach people to live in harmony with nature. The remake, for the most part, keeps with that. Barrett has many a speech about the planet crying out for help, and that's how the whole conflict is framed. It's certainly how it starts, and how most of it progresses. Okay, fine, I can live with that. Then, suddenly, at the end of the highway chase, at the very end of the game, literally at the 11th hour, because this goes beyond the confines of the game's story, the Whispers and Sephiroth suddenly take center stage. Through multiple cutscenes, we're basically shown and told that if the party doesn't stop the Whispers here and now, that history would be all sorts of fucked, and the world would basically explode. So now, suddenly, it's a save the world plot, I guess. The issue is that it didn't escalate to this point naturally at all, and it didn't because it's driven by plot phantoms, and not the real narrative of the game. The real narrative is only just beginning. The party is outside of Midgar and pursuing Sephiroth. That's the plot. That's what should escalate to save the world. This excursion to suddenly prevent the timeline from diverging from these whispers was really wholly unnecessary. And all of this talk of fate and destiny completely flies in the face of everything the game has going for it. The point of environmentalist stories is that humanity has put the Earth on a collision course for destruction. It's inevitable unless sudden, immediate, and sometimes even traumatic change occurs. In that way, the story is wholly about changing the fate of the planet and of, time itself. The introduction of something like the Whispers, then, ruin things. Their being present means that history can only happen one way. It doesn't matter what the characters do anymore. The Whispers can get them where they need to be and make happen what needs to happen for history to occur how it's supposed to. There's no choice, no real consequence. They can bring people back from the dead. So now, as you might imagine, there are no stakes. Now, all of your characterization and even improvements to the story are down the tubes. The plot phantoms won't let any of it have any kind of real impact of the story after all. Not convinced? Okay then, imagine a world where the original game didn't exist. Only the remake did. Imagine it was written in the exact same way. But now, we, as culturally savvy players, don't know that the plot phantoms are just keeping things on track with the original. Now, for all we know, they could do anything. Now, they're just there changing things like the hand of God and making it so nothing you accomplish actually matters. Now, there's no rhyme or reason to anything the characters do. It's an interesting experiment to take away the cultural context of a product, something that content creators I find regularly fail to do. This is why most Batman stories suck outside of the context of it being a Batman story. This is why most made way after sequels like Force Awakens, the new Terminator movies, etc., are terrible. Take away the context of a product, and suddenly all you're left with is the product, allowing you to really judge it. I viewed the gameplay in a similar vein. I don't care if this is a remake. I don't care if there were certain systems in the original that they carried over. I don't care that they did it to appease old fans. If it doesn't work, it just doesn't work. Back on track though, I'm thankful that I'm not alone in, thinking the ending is bad. Plenty of people online have joined me in my frustration on the typical Nomura-like style of storytelling, where they introduce these esoteric concepts out of nowhere and just expect us to go along with it. This is good. It shows that people aren't just blindly loving this game out of nostalgia, though there's plenty of that going on as well, trust me. As for where the story is going to go, it could do one of two things. One, the Whispers could be dead for good and we've created an alternate timeline, which is pretty exciting as it allows the game to veer off of the meandering mess that was the original game's middle portion. Or two, the Whispers could reform out of Sephiroth's will corrupting the lifestream or something, and we can continue on this path where the Whispers stop Cloud from saving Aerith or more stupid bullshit like that. Either way, I'm certainly not going to buy the second game just for the story. Closing thoughts. Like I said, I tried really hard to like this game. I played the demo twice. I tried to figure out what I liked and what I didn't, and then I bought the game, in addition to my brother ordering the game because I wanted to play it sooner. I was excited, and I wanted to love it, but I couldn't. Final Fantasy VII Remake, that is Part 1, is a game of conflicted priorities. It wants to please everyone, but only time will tell if it actually succeeded. At the very least, there's one person who it didn't please. The combat was atrocious. The side quests and exploration were dull and lacked any kind of effort or passion. And the story was just a meandering mess, bloated and boring. I felt the need to go hard on this game not because it's the worst thing ever. I consider it a failed experiment, to be applauded for taking risks with changing the combat and story and trying something new. But it was ultimately tied down too much by its adherence to its source material. Above all, I don't consider this game a real remake. Remakes keep things the same and updates them. This game is more of a reboot, a complete overhaul that changes a lot from the gameplay to the story. That mismarketing is perhaps why I became so mad, because I was constantly torn on what to expect out of it, which, along with the myriad little problems I had consistently, led to an overall unenjoyable experience. But I think that the real lesson to be learned from all of this negativity is that all of you should watch Final Fantasy VII Machine Abridged.